as inaugural winners of the 2040 prize, there's much I want to ask about your books, of course, but I also want to ask about the form, which is a very sort of writerly thing to do, to want to talk about the form of the long story or the short novel, what used to be called a novella. And it's obviously a thing that's dear to Finlay Lloyd's heart. It's such a central part of what we're doing at the moment, the 2040 prize. And we've embraced it very, very decidedly as being an interesting form. But I'm curious about why you were drawn to the form of the short novel or long story.
Oh, absolutely. I think quite apart from enjoying reading shorter works, because you can read them in a couple of hours, you don't necessarily need to race through them, the way that you might if you're getting to the end of your train trip, or, it's getting very late at night, you might sort of, be racing to finish a novel or finish a chapter. I think there's something about the novella that means you can both read it very quickly and also take your time to absorb what's going on. You get much more meat on the bones than you would with a short story that, tends to be a bit of a slice of time or a series of slices of time, but you don't go down the rabbit holes of subplots. Generally you're in a discrete story world that's going to take you somewhere that you can enjoy, usually in one or two reading pieces. But in terms of writing them, I feel a little bit the same way, in that, writing a novel is such a huge undertaking, or for me it is anyway. And because I tend to want to write at least a first draft, I tend to want to get it down in a fairly uninterrupted space. And I tend to work in chunks of, sort of maybe about, 6 weeks to a couple of months, 3 months if I'm lucky enough to have that amount of time off paid work. Writing a novel, I tend not to be able to complete it in that length of time, certainly not the first draft. So if I get interrupted, I have to start from the beginning again when I get my next chunk of time. But with a novella, once it presents itself as a novella, usually very early on in the writing process, I'm really excited, because I've got that sort of I can almost see the finish line, from very early on in the writing process, which excites me. I write faster. I finish that draft. As I was saying to Rebecca yesterday, it's like flying without the fear of having the aeroplane. It's a wonderful feeling and incredibly satisfying to have finished a first draft in one chunk.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I've often argued that structure is something that enables people, and I think one of the beauties of this form is that it's long enough to develop something, but it's not so long that you can get carried away with endless development. Does that ring true with you, Rebecca?
Yeah, it does. It's funny. I was thinking about what appeals. A lot of what Kim has said is the same thing that appeals to me as a reader and a writer. But I think what I like about novellas is that complexity that you can develop, and yet you still have that sense of fleetingness. Partly because perhaps, as Kim said, you're sitting down, you can read it in 1 or 2 sessions, but there is something about it that is both complete and fleeting. And a lot of the reading and the writing that I most enjoy is writing that captures that sense of a moment in time, taking a breath, a mood, something that you just want to capture, but you have enough space, unlike in a short story, to explore it and to have some room for introspection. That's what I most love about it as a writer and a reader. And I hadn't actually planned, when I originally started working with these characters in my head, to write a novella. But I became very aware over the last few years, while I was experimenting with writing, that my most comfortable word length is, probably somewhere between 20 and 40,000 words. I don't know whether that comes from my background writing young adult novels, because of course my first 2 novels were young adult novels and they tend to be that sort of length, or whether it's also a natural tendency in me. And it took me a long time to figure out that the characters I was working with and the story that was coming to me was actually more of a novella. And when that occurred in my head, it was like, oh, everything fit into place. The whole story just kind of fell into place. So it felt like a very natural structure or form.
Yes, I think that makes great sense with the nature of your writing, the suggestive quality of your writing. I mean, it's a cliche to say less is more, but I think sometimes this shorter form with writers gets them to leave out the things that are unnecessary and to suggest things more.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I think it's such a wonderful form and why we want to encourage it. So moving closer to the stories you tell in these wonderful books, I'm interested to tease out the sense that both books have, that they're very strong, engaging stories about transitions from childhood to adulthood, being a young person who's immersed in the world without reflection so much on your place in it, to the sudden realization of your place in it. So, Rebecca, I wondered how you see that.
It's really funny. When I started writing, this was my first attempt or entree, if I can use that word without being pretentious, into adult fiction for adults and literary fiction. And I never thought that I would write another coming of age story, but that's what this is. It is a coming of age story. It's told through Frankie's eyes, but the story she tells is the story of her sister as well as herself. And they are both struggling at different ages, of course, but actually they're both struggling with exactly what you were talking about, Julian, that transition from, not from childhood, but from adolescence into, well, both adulthood and becoming a woman, because those are two separate things, really. And I mean in an emotional sense and in a physical sense. Justine's struggle, because she's anorexic, has a very strong physical element to it, but behind every person who has an eating disorder, the hunger acts as a metaphor. So she is also struggling with, emotions and things that she's going to find more difficult as an adult. And I wanted, I think, to step outside Justine's mind and observe it from a younger person's mind, a younger person who has less understanding of what's going on and is less involved. So what we see through Frankie's eyes as a 14-year-old is what happens to Justine and what she says, but not what she's feeling, and it's an enigma. I think that Frankie looks to her older sister for an example of how to grow up, because she herself is trying to find her way through and struggling through adolescence, but what she sees is a role model who is perhaps struggling even more than her. It's a flawed role model, I guess. And she has to make her own way, her own transition into adulthood. And that's really what the story is about, if that makes sense.
Yes, but it's also enabled by the older Frankie being present too, looking at the younger Frankie. So it's not just an adolescent view, it's an older woman's view of her own life and her sister's life.
Previously, having written young adult novels, I've always written in the voice of the adolescent. What I enjoyed this time and in writing for an older age group is that very sense of reflection. So you're mediating between the adult that Frankie is now as she writes the book and the adolescent that she saw herself to be back then, and we have some interpretation of what she was feeling back then. I mean, that's, I think, one of the things that I'm most interested in writing about now, at my ripe old age of mid-50s, how we have become the person that we are and what decisions or events that happen to us at formative stages in our life that have led us to where we are now in our lives and what we do with that.
Yes, it's you touch on two things there, the value of perspective within the book, but also the value of perspective as a writer. As a writer, you don't have to be young to write well. Age can actually enrich your perspectives on the world that you write about. And Kim, coming to you, I mean, the interesting thing about your central protagonists, Clorinda and Dottie, is that they're not adolescents, but in some ways they've been protected from the reality of life by their circumstance. So they're perhaps confronting reality at a slightly older age, but being made to grow up at the same time, perhaps.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I just wanted to say first about Ravenous Girls, Rebecca's book, that it is wonderful to see that a part of, it's wonderful to have the perspective of the younger sister. I'm a younger sister myself, and I think any younger sister is going to find your narrative really resonant in so many ways, and that that we get to feel that transition as well, of her moving away from Justine as well, which can be a very uncomfortable thing to do for any younger sibling. So I just want to say that first, that's another element to the transition that really, really resonated with me. But yes, Dottie and Clorinda in Ladies' Rest and Writing Room, both around about the age of 21, and the story takes place in 1922 as Australia is kind of crawling out from under the despair of the fallout from the First World War. It's no mistake that they're sort of moving from adolescence into some form of adulthood, as the nation was at the time. That was quite a deliberate choice. But it's also time in, my own life. I'm often using historical fiction as a kind of a code or a cipher for me, working out certain experiences that I had at the age that my characters experienced them, and exploring what it means from a different perspective, and gaining a perspective myself on what my experiences were at that age. And it's a wonderful age to be writing about, because you are no longer a child, but at the age of 21, you haven't really had enough experience to be making very clear and firm decisions about your adult life. But as Julian just pointed out, the characters are very cloistered in their middle class world, but at the same time, because of their experiences of the First World War, of being young women left at home, they've experienced this kind of trauma at a remove throughout the war during their adolescence, and now coming to terms with the fallout from that, and the tragedies that both of them have experienced, that complicates their transition into adulthood and confuses them in all kinds of ways, particularly emotionally. So they have quite complex and rocky roads to traverse until they find a kind of a refuge in each other that is not necessarily a safe one either.
Kim, I was very drawn to Clorinda. I felt she's now experiencing a level of, is poverty the right word, or financial struggle?
Insecurity.
Anyway. Insecurity, thank you. And her feelings, her anger and her shame are very vivid and strong and convincing. And I think a lot of people, it's interesting that you've chosen this period of time to write about, when we are ourselves going through, in a contemporary sense, economic difficulties across the nation. I think there would be a lot of people now struggling financially who would feel the same things that Clorinda feels in your story, which I found very moving.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's not saying anything profound by saying that poverty is a trap, but it's a particular trap for Clorinda, in the sense that as she's discovering her own sense of herself and her sexuality in particular, she is feeling a lot of pressure to find the bloke as the rescuer, and blokes are pretty thin on the ground. Yeah. And the one that is chasing her is somebody that, for all sorts of reasons, she's not attracted to. So there's complication after complication, and entrapment after entrapment for Clorinda. Mm-hmm. And her life would have been quite different had she had the luxury of being the girl that she wanted to be, reading novels on the couch and probably having lots of wonderful female relationships and exploring things in a much, much more peaceful and productive way. But at the same time, if it hadn't been for those ructions, would Dottie and Clorinda have found themselves in that way? So, it's that sort of the way that we form relationships, particularly as young people, there's a randomness to that too, to the trouble that we get ourselves into, and the solutions and the serendipitous rescues that come out of, you know, those kind of sliding doors and shifting scenery of being a young person that we don't experience as much as we get older.
I mean, I think one of the things you're both touching on here is how at the core of most narratives, there are social norms or expectations or ideals that the lives of the central characters, protagonists in the story, are thrown out of in some way. And that's what makes us want to understand them, because we might go there. There's a sense of identification that we could be that person who's poor, that person whose lover is killed, or whatever that situation is, that makes us feel for those outsider characters that are intrinsic to narratives. And I wonder if how you feel that's true in your story, particularly about the way your central characters revolve around their sexuality.
Yeah, well, it's a time in life, isn't it, where your hormones are exploding and your desire for touch and sensuality is probably at its highest. My question in writing the novella, but also in reflecting on that time in my life too, was, you know, what was going on there? What was I after? What was I craving? And how does grief, as you know, sort of similarly reflecting on my own experience at about that age, how does grief interfere with those feelings? How does feeling like an outsider interfere with those feelings? So one of the things that I really loved about Rebecca's Ravenous Girls is that she's talking about the 1980s, which was precisely the time that I was feeling the sorts of things that Dottie and Clorinda experienced in the 1920s, which was just a wonderful sort of mirroring of feelings. And one of the things that struck me was that Dottie and Clorinda, being quite cloistered middle-class girls, don't have any kind of language for their feelings. In researching the kinds of exposure that they would have had to same-sex feelings, I just couldn't find anything. And even in the research from queer historians, I couldn't find anything that girls like them could have gone, that's me, or I have those feelings. There was no reflections for them to hang on to. So that it was really interesting to explore it in that way, that they're both really feeling their way without language. But on reflecting on what it was like for me in the 1980s, I felt in a strange way that I didn't have language either. Like a lot of kids who don't necessarily fit the boxes, I kind of knew what bisexuality was. I certainly knew what being gay or lesbian was, but I didn't feel that I belonged there because I didn't have any kind of confidence. So when I thought about who a queer person was, I looked at the confident person who was very articulate about their identity. And so it was, you know, well, I don't really belong there either. So it was really interesting for me to explore a time where there was no language, and being able to explore my own feelings through Dottie and Clorinda as well. Though I must add, what is certainly not autobiographical in Dottie and Clorinda is the fact that Dottie's father owns a very successful chocolate company. I wish. And she has an unlimited account at a, you know, salubrious department store. I didn't have that either. But in putting my characters in that kind of cloistered world, I was really exploring what it is to be without language and to be without kind of any kind of community or identity connection.
I was thinking as you were talking, Kim, you know, it's so true that whereas Clorinda and Dottie don't have the language, Frankie, who is a 14-year-old in 1985, has the language, and yet the language doesn't work for her. You know, like she, and this is a very small element of the story. I don't explore it a great deal, and mostly Frankie reflects on it as in her adult voice rather than at the time, but she remarks at one point that in the year following, she gets an overwhelming crush on a girl in her class. And she knows with her 1980s sensibility that it's okay to like a girl. Like, that's what everybody says. It's okay to like a girl. But it doesn't feel okay to her, because what the word okay doesn't encompass is what's normal, what's conformity about, what's acceptance about, what does it actually mean to be okay, what does it mean to like a girl. Those things, the words, the language doesn't speak to her at all. And so even though she has some words for it, they still don't encompass her feelings. They still don't encompass how she can accept herself and live with herself. At the same time as she's exploring that side of her sexuality, I think she sees in Justine a very disordered sexuality, because this isn't a recovery story. So it's not a story with a neat, happy ending about someone going into hospital and having treatment for their eating disorder and coming out the other end better. That's not what happens. And that's not what happens for most people. Justine spends many years lost in a wilderness of anorexia, up and down. And during that time, she herself becomes really quite sexually active. I only mention this in a couple of sentences because it's a later part of the story that Frankie doesn't explore a great deal. But I wanted to portray something about people with anorexia that often isn't talked about. Our stereotypical image of someone who is experiencing anorexia is someone who has starved themselves to put a false constraint on growing up, to stop being a sexual being, to stop, for many people if they are women, to stop being a woman, to reduce their body back to a slightly more, I'm saying this with quotation marks, but an innocent embodiment. But that's not what happens with Justine. She is, during some years of quite extreme emaciation, she's very sexually active. And without discussing that in great deal, I wanted to make a reference to the fact that people use their bodies in many ways to harm themselves, not just by starving themselves, but by also throwing themselves into physical relationships that are harmful, that are not sensitive. So I wanted to kind of explore both those aspects of sexuality, just in touching on them, if that makes sense.
I think in touching on it, actually, you have it in really good balance, because we have that sense of the trajectory of Justine's life compared with Frankie, who actually is very perceptive. And she's unsure, she's awkward, but she's actually very perceptive. And she also wrestles with the fact that people around her, contemporaries, don't like who she might be. And so I think one of the central things that are wrestled with here in the book, in both books, is the middle class has expectations that are quite a straitjacket on people's behavior.
Yeah.
And they're finding their way through those normative ideas of who you should be.
Yeah.
In your book, Frankie's, I think the way you touch on her sexuality is so lucidly simple, but it captures that awkwardness really, really well. And for you, Kim, I think the unsaid element of who they are sexually is beautifully traversed too, because they couldn't speak about it, but their inner natures come out as the book progresses.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Kim, you used the word belonging at some point when you were talking, and I was thinking that both our novels are about actually two girls in both cases, funnily enough, who are seeking a sense of belonging and not finding it. They are, that they've either been ostracized from the place they think they belong to, or they have never found a place they belong to socially. Yeah, it's a very strong theme in both books, I think.
And also the manifestations of grief in Ravenous Girls, they happen or they manifest in physical ways. In Ladies' Rest and Writing Room, they manifest more in emotional ways, and particularly in Dottie's anxiety and her suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
It was interesting to write about those kind of deeply personal and contemporary experiences of mine and consider what that extra layer of isolation would mean for someone like Dottie, who has no language for mental distress either. Women are often, said to be much more emotionally capable, certainly at expressing themselves and figuring things out emotionally. And, us girls, we all stick together, don't we? And we sort things out emotionally. That's certainly not been my experience. And I think, sort of wind the clock back 100 years, what must it have been like for those young women? And I'm thinking of, one of my grandmother's older sisters who would have experienced something very similar to Dottie, in the sense of having had the young lover go overseas and essentially disappear out of her life. How would that play with your emotions in terms of understanding whether that young love, first love experience was even real? What kind of, mental gymnastics did young women have to go through in order to make it out the other side of that particular war, and all of the things that it did to the country? How does that operate at a personal level? It's not something that we see very often in Australian historical fiction, those kind of deep plumbs into female emotional and psychological experience. So it was something that was probably the most challenging part of the novella to write, but probably the most real for me, in the sense of really wanting to because I have had those feelings myself in a very contemporary sense. What must it have been like with that extra layer of silence and expectation that you would be a good girl, go and get married, do the right thing, stiff upper lip and all that sort of stuff, just suck it up, princess. Well, what happens when you can't?
One of the things I loved about your book, Kim, was that there's almost like two contexts. There's the room that Dottie goes in to write, and where she and Clorinda first reunite or reconnect, I suppose. And then each time she leaves it and she goes back out onto the street, she is confronted with this shrieking, seething, joyous, tumbling, like non-stop life, the tumult of life on the street, which came across to me hugely vividly and very, like it was very, I got it through all my senses. But I also loved the contrast between that and that inner sense of she's seeking peace, she's seeking respite. And I wondered if that was a deliberate strategy, or did that just happen organically from the story?
Very naturally. And I think that, anybody in tumult, experiences a city, particularly something as smelly and noisy and frenetic as Sydney, which is, my hometown. There wasn't much fiction going on in writing those experiences of walking down Pitt Street, that's for sure, and that feeling of intense unease of being in the world and craving, as you say, craving peace. And it's a beautiful contrast again to the kind of deceptive peace of Frankie's world, going into the family home in your novella and feeling that sense of quiet and hearing the tinkle of the piano. You can almost see the dust motes floating, and you can hear the ABC News being turned on in 1985 or whatever. That sense of the loneliness of the family home, that hole in the home, that there's something missing, there's something you're craving about the safety of home that you're not getting. And you do that in such a contrasting and very quiet but such a powerful way.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah.
Well, I was there inside that family home as much as you were in Pitt Street.
This
is Rebecca and Kim's mutual appreciation.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it should be too, which is, I suppose, what you're starting to talk about here is whether the books are historical novels, which I suppose is true for both of them, even though perhaps more true for yours, Kim. And it suggests our talking about what drew you to those moments in time and place and ethos. So, seeing we've been talking about your book, Kim, the judging panel was impressed by the very tangible sense of time and place in your book, even though, of course, you can't have lived there. But the book wears its research quite lightly. And I suppose the question is, what drew you to that particular time?
Well, early 20th century Sydney is kind of a place that fascinates me, basically because it was my grandparents' Sydney. So I'm drawn to what they might have experienced. Certainly Farmer's Department Store, where the Ladies' Rest and Writing Room resides, is a place of my childhood. My grandmother took me there when I was little. We would go to the fabric sales and, fossick through the remnant tables and things like that during school holidays. So there are those fond memories. But because I work mostly, I write mostly historical fiction, and I love history. I'm a bit of a magpie in terms of Australian social history. I'm often fossicking around the old newspapers on Trove, and I really cannot remember what I was looking for the day that I found the little advertisement for the Ladies' Rest and Writing Room in Farmer's Department Store. This little advertisement dated 1922 in the Sydney Morning Herald, and as soon as I saw it, two things happened. And it's often the way with me with beginning a story. I see something and I go, oh, all the synapses start firing. And the first thing I realised was, this is 1922. This is a story about women. Suddenly I'm writing a story about women just from this advertisement. This is a story about women in the wake of World War II. But then when I rested on the description of the Ladies' Rest and Writing Room being, decked out in these rosy shades, I saw this pink refuge, this absolute refuge for women to be together. And immediately it took me back to my own little tender romance at about the age of 20. And I was there with that old friend exploring those things. And pretty much the story wrote itself after that point. I was there. And the reason why I think the history is so lightly interwoven into most of what I write is because I go back there so often. And it is my town. So I can kind of, although Sydney has changed significantly over the last 100 years, a lot of the buildings, a lot of the main buildings are there, As soon as I see the QVB, when I go into Sydney, I have a whole bunch of memories of when the QVB was not the lovely, sort of shopping centre that it is now. And when I see, Maya now, I remember its iterations as Grace Brothers and Farmers before that. So when I go to Sydney, I have these layers of history already there. I have this natural curiosity. And of course, because of it was my grandparents' city.
Well, that absolutely explains how natural the setting seems to be, because there is a direct line of connection there for you, as well as your love of recreating the past. I suppose with you, Rebecca, the connection to the 80s is far more immediate even. But the judging panel was particularly engaged by the focus on the impact of Justine's illness on her family. And that timeless issue of the sense of families and how they're dysfunctional is at the heart of this. But there is also a really strong sense of that time and place and moment, not just a timeless story. So I think the label of historical fiction is not inaccurate to your story, but it's probably not the way you thought of it, I imagine.
It's so funny. When you first said to me that you thought my novel was historical, I just about died. I thought, oh my goodness, is that how old I am? But it is how old I am. It is a period of history. And historical novel, I think, is right. The 1980s are a long time ago now. Having said that, I didn't have to do historical research to bring them bring the 1980s back into my mind. I would have been 15 in 1985. So describing the world through an adolescent's eyes in the 1980s came very instinctively to me. Where the authenticity comes from is my own experience of adolescence in that time. I don't feel that I can speak to a contemporary teenager with any authenticity. Where my sense of adolescence comes from, even though adolescence is a universal experience, is deeply embedded in the 1980s. I also have a big love for, like, one of the promises I made to myself when I first started writing was that Adelaide would always be recognisably Adelaide in any fiction I wrote. I don't think I actually named Adelaide specifically in this book, but anyone who has lived in Adelaide will recognise it. And that's super important to me, partly because I like to write about home. Similarly to Kim, it's drawing on what is a part of me, but it's also because the books I love, the books I most love, are embedded in place. And I don't want to there's so much, I know Australians talk about cultural cringe, but Adelaideans are particularly bad about it. We're this little country town. That's what everybody thinks about us. And I want to bring Adelaide to the world. So 1980s Adelaide is what came to me. And I should just very quickly mention ABBA here, because ABBA's a huge it's a little element in the story, but it's an important element in the story. And that came from a promise that I made to myself many years ago too. So while the novel isn't autobiographical, when I was growing up, I had a younger sister. I was actually the older sister of two. Like Justine and Frankie, I could literally sing to you every song in there, like literally every song. I know all their lyrics. And I made a promise to myself many years ago that one day I would write a book that made reference to that, because they're part of my childhood. They're part of the person who I became. And you got to love what's also embarrassing. So...
Yes, well, it's woven in wonderfully into the thread of the narrative and the whole story of Frankie visiting her sister in the hospital. And yes, it's a lovely part of the naturally organic shape of that book. So to finish, both of you, I have to ask about the 2040 prize as an idea and about prizes in general. I mean, I've always personally disliked the winner-takes-all aspect of competitions of any sort, but our excuse is at least 2 books get to win each year. So we're spreading it a little more widely, and it's wonderful to have you both as the inaugural prize winners for the prize. But I just wonder if you have any feelings about obviously you're not displeased to be prize winners, but do you have any comments about the whole notion of this sort of thing and about the 2040 prize in particular?
Well, I think this experience, if I can go first, has been wonderfully collaborative and collegial. It's been an experience like no other. I work in Australian publishing, have done for 27 years, and I've published a few books in the past, but I have never had such a nourishing experience as working with you, and I'm sure that Rebecca feels the same. And the way that you have encouraged Rebecca and I to have a relationship with this experience, inside this experience, is just wonderful. So it feels like a win on so many levels. And the only other thing that I would really love to say about it is that thank you to the judges for choosing 2 stories about vulnerable young women. That just makes my heart sing. So often, as a woman writer, writing about relationships, writing about concepts of, love and our emotional lives, we're often, sort of put in the box of, women's fiction. We're made to feel that our stories don't quite have the literary worth or heft of some other kinds of narratives. So my heart will be full forever, thanks to the judges' choice of not just my book, but Rebecca's as well. It's a beautiful thing, unforgettable. So, if there's a message that I want to send to anybody out there who's considering submitting a novella for next year's 2040 prize, absolutely go for it.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. That's lovely. And I just have to say that as the publisher who was on the judging panel, it was a wonderfully collaborative, positive experience engaging with writers' work. I mean, I always, as a writer myself, I find it very moving to see people put their work out there in the hope that someone will engage with it. And we've tried to respond as much as possible to those entrants and to give them some feedback and to encourage them to enter the prize again. So thank you for endorsing that. And as for women's stories, what an interesting irony, because people's stories matter no matter who you are and where you come from. But the fact that the panel chose 2 stories about young women by women writers was a lovely surprise, because of course the prize was totally judge blind, so we didn't know who the writers were. And Rebecca, do you have any comments about the prize itself?
I just want to celebrate the fact that there is a prize for a novella on the Australian literary scene now. I'm actually a big believer in prizes. I think they're a fabulous way for someone to submit a manuscript that might otherwise just get left on a slush pile. I've had good experience. That was how I got my first book published. I was the winner of the Verona Award for Unpublished Manuscripts many, many years ago, and that's what enabled me to get published in the first place. I think that there is something very democratic, or there should be. It doesn't always work that way, but in principle, there is a democratic principle behind prizes that allows people's writing, not who they are or why they are or where they are or what money they have, to be recognised just for the strength of their writing and for their story. But, let's face it, the Australian literary scene is small because we're a small country. There are not many opportunities. And Finlay Lloyd Publishing has brought another opportunity into the writing world. And I just think that's hugely exciting and worth celebrating. I'm just immensely grateful for that. Yeah, so, yeah.
Well, thank you. And the fact that the prize is blind and removes who the writer is from our consideration is really important to me, because I know what it's like to be a writer and struggling in it may be a small pond, but it's still a very contested pond with lots of people trying to be noticed.
Yeah.
And we're a very small publishing house too, so I'm not trying to inflate what we're doing, but anything that we can do to encourage writers to submit. And you both are previously published writers, and we didn't know that, obviously. So it's about you having developed your craft, and maybe people will enter 2040 2 or 3 times before they get somewhere with that to get shortlisted or maybe even eventually win the prize. But the fact that it's possible to be judged for what you write rather than who you are is at the heart of what.
Absolutely. And, I hope we get the chance to celebrate that. So, because it's worth celebrating. And I hope that the 2040 prize goes for many years so that other people get a chance to celebrate it too.
Well, we certainly hope so. We're a small non-profit press, but we will be doing our best to make it live on into the future. And we just, on behalf of the judging panel and everyone at Finlay Lloyd, I just want to congratulate you both again on winning the prize, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.